Hi, and welcome to 2022. And welcome to another episode of Kasper On BI. I'm very excited to be back in the new year with a new guest. Today, we're going to talk to Meagan Longoria. And Meagan is a BI consultant with Danny Cherry and Associates. She's a MVP, has been on the block, around the block for quite a while. She knows data warehousing, BI, analysis services, Power BI, data visualization, everything. But that's not what we're going to talk about today, or not. That's not going to be the main focus of what we're going to talk about today, because Meagan is very passionate about one thing, and that's accessibility. And accessibility is something that we can all learn from, me including, because every day people use our reports and our dashboards and our products and our tools, but they're probably not accessible. And what does accessibility mean? Well, according to Wikipedia, accessibility means ability to access and benefit from some system or entity. The concept focuses on enabling access for people with disabilities, or enabling through the use of assistive technologies. So it mostly means people with disabilities, and this can be a wide variety of range. Maybe you're blind, or maybe colorblind. In the world that we are in today, with Power BI, with lots of visuals and lots of colors, this can be a problem. And Meagan is an expert in this area. She made it a passionate project. She's presenting on it on conferences and news groups. So I'm really excited to learn more from her. So with that, let's go to the episode. Hi, Meagan. Honored to have you here on the Kasper On BI channel. Of course, many people already know you for all your Power BI knowledge and data modeling and all of these things. Can you share a little bit what you do in your company and a little bit of your background?
Sure. I'm a consultant with Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. We're kind of a smaller boutique firm that works in the Microsoft data stack. So I work with a bunch of DBAs and data architects and a couple of BI developers.
Nice. And so were you always into data, or yeah?
I didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated from college, but I started at a company that they kind of brought you in and trained you for a few weeks, and then they placed you based upon your interests. And I majored in international business with a minor in computer science, so I wanted to stay a little techie, but I didn't want to be a straight up like .NET developer in the
Oh, yeah.
beginning. And so I went through this program, and it ended up that this one team in finance in this what is now like, well, I guess it's getting bought, but what is now a Fortune 1000 company, had an opening in their financial reporting team. But it wasn't just like your normal have PeopleSoft spit out reports. They had their own data mart. They had analysis services back in 2007.
Nice.
So I kind of accidentally fell into that for my first job, and I liked it so much. I've been doing it ever since.
Oh, yeah, that's good. So I was a .NET developer, but yeah, at one point I moved away and also went into the data world. So that's really cool. And so what about, I know one of your passions, and this is what we're talking about today too, is accessibility. So when did you become interested in it, and why?
I think accessibility is just an extension of my love for data viz. I think that if you are really into data visualization, then you should be really into accessibility too. So if you're doing it right, data viz is, helping people understand and access your data, the trends in the data, the insights, all of that. So, whereas a lot of people think of it as separate, oh, well, there's data viz design skills and then there's accessibility. I see it all as one thing. So, I probably started paying attention to it more as I got into consulting and had opportunities to see where that could be more useful. And I worked with, some cities, some school districts, things like that where it could really pay off and you could immediately see the use or the requirement for being more accessible. But I really just got into it kind of out of my own interest. But there is kind of a side piece to that is I grew up with a father who was losing his sight, and
Uh-huh.
so we have lots of funny stories about how he, burned a tablecloth at my birthday party because he was losing feeling in his fingers, how he could play basketball with me, but he had to use his peripheral vision because he didn't have straightforward vision very well anymore. But he also had all this adaptive technology. So I remember somebody coming into my house and they had this little kind of basically just a battery with a sensor on it that you could put in your drink cup that would let you know when you've finished, filling your drink. And my dad has one of those bright yellow keyboards, so it's super high contrast. And he's learned to use he has a big OCR machine that can read text to him. So he's got all this cool adaptive technology that really does make a difference for him. When some of it started breaking, he stopped using his computer. And then when they came back and taught him, new versions and had better assistance technologies, he was back in it. My dad he's legally blind, but he can use Excel. He keeps notes in there. He's able to do all of that through really small changes available in very popular products. And that's kind of why what I see happening with Power BI as well. We can make accessible data viz for the most part. There's always areas for improvement, but we can do so much with what we have right now with just little adjustments.
Yeah, and I think, this is also why I want to talk to you, because and I watched some of your sessions about it too. If you don't have a disability, you have no clue. So the majority of us building reports and models and dashboards, we never think about it. And yeah, it's bad. I feel bad, and we should think about it more, right?
We absolutely should. And I think there's kind of the moral sense, like you're excluding people and you shouldn't. But if you just think about it more as there's a book called Mismatch, and it's I want to say her name is Kat Holmes. She used to work at Microsoft at one time, I think. And she writes about accessibility and how she sees it and how inclusion should shape design. And I really like the way she's better formed the way that I think about it too. So if you think about accessibility and inclusion as I have an audience that needs my report, my data visualization, and it's not meeting their needs. You go to a website and it's broken, it doesn't work for you, but it really is working. How many times have you logged a support ticket to someone and they go, oh, you just do this really convoluted thing that no one would ever figure out on their own?
Yeah.
Think of it like that. Like you have an audience and you have a product, and there's a mismatch between their abilities to use it and what you've given them. And so I'm trying to, fix that mismatch to be able to reach more people, or at least reach the core people. Data viz is kind of hard because sometimes we don't know our audience. Sometimes we make data visualization for the public. Well, the public is really diverse.
Yeah.
But the best thing you can do is go follow people that have disabilities and see what they do. A few years ago, I dated a man who was blind, and it was kind of fascinating to me how he used a computer. He helped test project management software for a while to say whether or not it was screen reader accessible. And I found it fascinating. And that caused my very first blog post about accessibility, screen reader accessibility in Power BI, because I watched what he was doing. And I'm going to tell you, it was really, really awful back then. It was really bad. It was unusable. And then the Power BI team came back in and they fixed a whole lot of that. And so it is actually usable now for a screen reader. And people go, why would you use a screen reader? Blind people don't use data visualizations. Well, they absolutely do. And I think the last 2 years has been a big deal to prove that. All these COVID reports, what's the rate right now? All of those have to be accessible. So it is a big exposure thing. And I don't think anyone's out there, intentionally making inaccessible data viz, but they don't understand, the consequences of their design choices. And so you'll find people every once in a while, I'll come across someone who will raise their hand and go, I have this disability, and let me tell you how hard it is. And then I'm so excited because I want to pick their brain.
Of course, yeah.
Microsoft has a really good inclusive design website that kind of tells you how to go about inclusive design, just in general, not data viz or Power BI specific. And they talk about, learning from others' experiences. And so we have to go ask people, how do you use this? What's really hard for you? And to be honest, we should be doing that anyway.
Yes.
When I test my Power BI reports, the way that I test is I have essentially a set of questions that lead to goals, not how do you feel about the report? If the report is about sales, I ask them, can you find the quarterly sales number? What is, what is, and this is not phrased very well because I'm talking off the cuff, but what's the number for this product category? Because the important things that I have in my report, I want to make sure that they can get to.
Mm.
And I'll find people occasionally who will tell me they're colorblind. There's actually a few in the SQL Server community that will tell you that. And so that's kind of everybody's first intro to data viz accessibility is, oh, don't use red and green together. And it's actually fascinatingly more complex than that. And you can, if you want to nerd out on something, you can get into color theory, which is a lot of fun. And there's actually a lot of math involved in that.
Oh, yeah.
There's just, it's not just red and green. It's, sometimes purple and gray will do it. And just there's about 12 different color combinations you want to be aware of. And people go, oh, that's a lot. What if you're not a design person? Well, there's tools to help you. So Adobe has a great tool where you can put in your color palette and it'll tell you if it's, take this with a grain of salt, but tell you if it's colorblind friendly. So you don't have to guess. There are guidelines for that. There are guidelines for color contrast. And that is honestly the one thing I think people, if everybody improved their color contrast, our reports would be so much more readable to so many more people. Just you'll see people, especially on Twitter, comment about, oh, they put, medium gray text on a light gray background. No one can read that. Well, we're all doing that in our data viz too.
Yeah.
No one can read it.
Yeah, it makes sense. And so probably the hardest part in this is too, and how do you sell it? Like, I know it's easy for example, if you go to an organization and you have a BI project, is it like the first question you will get, or what you think is, it's more expensive to build reports that are accessible and all of these things. Is that true or is it not true?
I think once you get experienced with it, it doesn't take any more time really. And I've stopped trying to sell it. When I build you a report, it's going to have baseline accessibility. I'm not going to build you an inaccessible report. If you would like one, you can go ask someone else to build it. I'm in a privileged spot where I can do that. And not every report is going to be perfect because the secret about accessibility is you can't have something that is accessible for every single person on the earth all at once. But when I do need to kind of sell it in, it's more about productivity for me, especially internally. It's a lot easier to say, I'm going to take an extra, let's say, you're a beginner at this and you want to make sure you do it right and you take it slow and careful. Let's say it takes you an extra hour or two. Next week, one of your coworkers breaks their finger and they can't use a mouse anymore. They can't click. And so they're having to navigate your reports in another way. Well, you've already set tab orders so that they can use their left hand to tab through all the visuals. And Power BI actually lets you interact with pretty much every single piece of the visual. I can navigate into a bar chart, select a bar so that it cross filters everything else on the page. Same thing with a line chart. I can select every individual point. I can select an axis label to say, I just want to see stuff from this month. So it's it's almost like a business continuity thing. The more things I can build in now, when maybe somebody has a temporary disability like the broken finger, or somebody starts losing their vision, we're all getting older, our eyesight is getting worse for pretty much everybody. We don't have to go back and spend hours changing thousands of reports because we've already started good design habits. And most of our reports have some level of whatever your organization has determined to be baseline accessibility.
So when you
I
go
kind
out
of don't ask permission.
But is it, maybe we can pivot to the other way around. Is it an extra thing that you say when you're building your report? Do you actually mention it, they're baseline accessible, or you just don't mention it? It's just there?
I do mention it because I want to educate people because, maybe I make 3 reports for a client and then they go on to make their own reports, or they have other consultants come in and do something. I want them to ask the next people for the same thing. And so I have a checklist on my website, but it looks remarkably like the one in Microsoft Docs because they borrowed from me and then updated from there. And so I point people to that and go, you know what, this isn't going to make your reports 100% accessible, but this is a good kind of baseline. Make sure you've done all these things in Power BI. This will get you there, for a lot of things and kind of future proof it for when somebody does need that, for when you do hire someone who doesn't see very well or is colorblind or can't use a mouse, that type of thing.
Makes
So,
sense.
yes, I tell them, but I don't offer it as an option.
Oh, that's good. I think,
It
but
just
it's
is.
probably for people who are watching this or thinking about it, like it could be an additional like reason why people want to come to you as a consultant. Like, okay, I'm giving you, I have this experience, or actually maybe you should have a certificate or something. That would be pretty nice. Like designing accessibility or something. That actually would be an interesting idea.
Yeah, there is kind of a generic accessibility certificate from Microsoft you can get, but it's not specific to data viz.
Hmm.
So there isn't, because we all use different tools, and a lot of us are limited by the tools we use as to what kind of accessibility we can offer. That's an area that's kind of growing, right? If you go and use Tableau, there are different accessibility options in there. And Tableau doesn't let you get into every single piece of a visual with a keyboard. They treat images or visualizations, charts, more like an image. And so there's a different philosophy over there, and you use different tools, but the color vision deficiency stuff, the color contrast stuff, all of that is all the same. So what I'm noticing is that people who get into this kind of get into it tool or technology specific. And then we have to go talk to other people in the industry that use other tools to round out our knowledge a little bit. So I look at a lot of website design accessibility sources. In general, WCAG guidelines can be used for data viz. And so there's some back and forth about whether they're fully research based, but they inform a lot of design policy in companies across the world. So they're a good place to start, just to read through and see what you can apply. That's where I get my color contrast guidelines from and the keyboard accessibility stuff. So it's kind of a learn what's available in your tool and then branch out. So there's actually a data visualization society that you can join
Mm.
for free. And they have Slack channels, and one of them is accessibility. And so it's people who make their own interactive data viz, people who use Tableau, people who use Power BI and Excel. And so I kind of just watch them and see what questions they ask, and see how their tools work as well to help me figure out how to use Power BI better.
Oh, that's pretty cool. So we talk about accessibility. Are there different areas inside of accessibility? You already talked about like tab order and there's colors. Is there anything else, or are those it?
Oh, there's a lot. I tend to divide them into really broad categories like visual accessibility, audible accessibility, motor accessibility, how you interact like with a mouse or a keyboard, and cognitive accessibility. And the kind of I won't say unexplored, but unexplored by the average Power BI user, definitely area. And maybe the most important is actually cognitive accessibility. So think of people who have trouble reading or trouble remembering things. How can we make data viz that better serves them? And what we learn is that when we do that, we help lots of other people in the process. So people who speak English as a second language or who just started a new job, all those technical terms that we like to throw into reports because we assume everyone knows it. What if we explain those or spell them out, provide a glossary? That helps so many more people than the one person with the learning disability or the reading disability. So, in general, and that's called the curb cut effect, when we design for one type of access, we end up helping a lot more people. And so it's curb cut because curbs, at least in the US, have kind of the downslope at the corners so people in wheelchairs can go down them and cross the street safely. But it also helps parents who are pushing children in strollers. It helps city workers who have to push big carts across the street. there are so many more people that get help. So that's why we call it the curb cut effect.
Makes
But
sense.
once you start getting into this, you realize, oh man, just by doing this one thing, by spelling these things out, by defining my terms, by writing better chart titles that provide better conclusions instead of using the default whatever Power BI populated based on the field names, you help so many people and increase your accessibility.
Makes sense. So, and I think we already kind of talked about this, but how can we make sure, or as a report author in an organization, how can we make sure that, or how do you sell it to your manager? When to worry about it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, you worry about it now because you don't want a bunch of rework later. If you're going to do an ad hoc, let me build this chart real quick and it's throwaway, no, I'm not putting alt text on my chart that only I'm using. But if you're building for any other person, whether it's your team, whether it's, another department or the whole company, somebody somewhere is losing productivity because they can't use your report the way that you intended. So it's really start now and start little bitty habits. Fix your colors, get a color palette. The nice thing is, I can design one or two color palettes, and maybe I rearrange the order of colors of like what the first color is that I use as my main color. But I can design one or two color palettes, make sure they've got good contrast, and then reuse them. That decision is made. I don't ever have to do it again unless I just feel like changing color palettes or my company rebrands or something.
Yeah.
Making sure your text has good color contrast. If you have a white background, you're looking for dark text. If you have a dark background, you're looking for white text. Don't do something like blue on a gray background because it's usually not good contrast. That didn't take you any extra time. So start with the stuff that you can kind of make a decision once and do it and don't ask permission, just start doing it. And then you can go to your manager and say, hey, I've started doing this and here's how it helps people. And in case someone later requests this kind of accommodation, we've got it covered. We
Mm.
don't have to wait until somebody joins our department and is colorblind and doesn't use a mouse. It'll be set for them. Because if you wait and you've got 100 reports, guess what you're going to have to pay someone to do when someone comes in and says, oh, I don't use a mouse. I only use a keyboard. Or I use an eye tracker to build or to read reports. So, do you want to go back and fix all of that at once, which somebody will miss something, or do you want to just start doing it now? It I think it's kind of an easy sell because it doesn't really take much more time, but it can increase employee productivity, it can avoid lawsuits, it can make people feel included.
Yeah.
I am I tweeted once because I want to say it might have been the business analytics conference or one of the Microsoft Insights conference. They showed this dashboard and the color contrast was so bad. And I think Will was presenting, but I know he didn't make it. But I pick on people a little bit because I know it could have been better because I'm waiting like the one day when they show a report and it actually has good color contrast, both for color vision deficiency, color blindness, and just for general vision. And somebody goes, oh my gosh, I can read that. How did you do? What changes did you make? Because the big thing is everything that Microsoft does, everything that Microsoft MVPs do, people just known in the community, everything your consultant does, somebody is copying. So if I can get this right, then a lot of my clients can start getting this right. And if that one influencer at my client can get it right, then the rest of their team can start. And there is no 100% right, I want to clarify. But, if I can start getting this better, then I've already influenced, maybe dozens of people just by building this one report that got some visibility in an accessible way.
Makes sense. Okay, so let's start becoming a bit more. So let's say I'm a Power BI user. Where do I start with making them accessible? I think you already said it. Pick a nice color palette that is accessible, but also falls within the confounds of the company colors. Is that number one?
It can be, yeah.
So if
If
you
you
had,
have reports, I would say do that and set your tab order. Tab order is super important. Um, Anybody that uses a screen reader or navigates using a keyboard, the the order that we view visuals, which tends to be left to right, top to bottom, they need to be able to land on those visuals in the same order.
Mm.
Well, by default, Power BI can't know that necessarily. Like when I build a report, I may add 3 charts and then move them around. So one that started at the top is now at the bottom. So
Yeah.
there is, especially in the last few months, there are things to help you with that. In Power BI now, there are some extra buttons that will change your tab order for you so that it does left to right, top to bottom sort order so that it's actually set where, let's say, 75% of your reports probably need it to be.
Mm.
There's a few exceptions, like when we start making fancier reports, but for most of us, that'll do it. So go to each page and click the button, and that's it. And then you have a pretty decent tab order for most of us.
So color palette, tab order. That's the main two things to get started with.
Yep. And then you can move into using really descriptive chart titles. Um, as I said earlier, it helps with cognitive accessibility. But have you ever looked at a good data viz where they state the conclusion in the chart title so you know what you're getting? And you're like, oh, now I know what to expect. And now you're going to go read the chart in depth to get more detail. That helps you and me, just like it helps somebody who, maybe uses a screen reader or has trouble processing information, takes a little longer. Because if our chart titles are really good, somebody can read them and decide if that chart is relevant to them and if it's worth the effort to go and look into it really deeply, or if they should move on to the next chart. That's kind of how the screen reader reads anyway. It's going to read the chart type and the chart title along with the alt text. So when somebody with a screen reader encounters a chart, that's the first thing they get. So if you start doing that, you will probably increase the efficiency of information intake for everybody, not just someone with a diagnosed disability.
Makes sense. And actually, maybe this is a stupid question, but I just don't know. And now, when you're talking to me about it, makes me curious. Do you know if, like, someone who has a disability, maybe they're blind or they can't see, and they hearing the screen reader, are they drawing it in their head? Are they visualizing it?
Um, I think that depends on if they've been able to see in the past or not. The way that we imagine things in our head is shaped by our experiences, right? So
Mm.
somebody who became blind later in life might function differently than someone who has been blind from birth. So I'm not going to speak for everybody, but from what I know, from my dad, he pictures some things in his head because he could see for 40 something years.
Yeah.
He's not totally blind, but there's a lot he can't see anymore. So they probably think about the information. They might not picture a chart in their head if they've never actually seen a chart, which would make a lot of sense.
Yes.
But they are holding information in their head. Um, you know, People who can see think about things differently. A lot of people with dyslexia will tell you that they kind of think in what they call 3D. Like they think about things in a different manner. So it's not, specific to just vision impairments either. So we're trying to reach as many people as possible. Then I'm going to make a chart, but also have a way to drill into kind of a table of data and also make it keyboard accessible and also add alt text so I can try to cover my bases. The best thing you can do, though, is figure out who your audience is. See if they have any disabilities. Some people won't volunteer the information because there's a lot of discrimination against people with disabilities. So if they don't have to tell you, they might not, because some disabilities are invisible. You can't see them. You don't know that someone is colorblind immediately. They would kind of have to tell you.
Yeah, or
Others are
maybe
more
even
obvious. If
dyslexia is also like,
Yeah, you don't know when someone's dyslexic unless they tell you or they specifically come to you and ask for some kind of help or accommodation.
so that actually leads
So if
me
you
to, how do I test it? How do I, as a developer, now know what to do?
So there's some things that you can test and some things you might have to get feedback on. And you can go super deep into this. So like actual companies with actual design teams can do um, R&D and testing and figure some of this out. I work in an 8-person consultancy, so I don't have the time and funding to do that. But if I know that I'm designing for a specific type of disability, a specific type of access, then I may have somebody else, with that disability test it. So when I first started making reports for screen readers, I had my blind friend actually run me through it and help me learn how he would access that report. But you can do some of this yourself. So you can definitely use a keyboard um, and try to tab through everything and interact with your report. And you typically find, your tab order is not quite right. It's Alt Shift F11 gives you kind of the keyboard or the screen reader accessible table of data behind a chart. And you'll discover that some of those tables, especially with custom visuals, don't look like what you would expect. They don't convey the same information.
Mm.
Um, a good example is a waffle chart. I forget exactly which one of the custom visual waffle charts it is, but it shows you a percentage. And so when we look at it, we go, oh, it's 82%. But the actual underlying data is still like the base numbers and not the percentage. And so that means that I'm going to have to add some extra information with my alt text to make it make a little more sense. So you'll find stuff like that when you test with a keyboard. There are a billion and one tools out there to test for color contrast, and there are different rules for it. So I actually have a little desktop tool that I like to pull up. And so I first check my color palette in general and just plug the colors into a website and make sure that the ones that I use together have good contrast. But then once I've already built my charts, I also go back and check. And so I know that, my text needs to have a contrast from the background of 4.5 to 1. The bars in my bar chart need to have a contrast of 3 to 1. And the tool will tell you that. So it's a free tool that I use, and you can use any of them. Honestly, most of them all cover WCAG 2.1 standards, and that's what I use. So you just kind of use the eyedropper like we have in PowerPoint to get that color and then get the background color and go, is this color contrast good? So that you can do on your own. You can check colorblind friendliness of your colors using the Adobe website. There's lots, if you get into the kind of extra tools, like we have all the external tools for data modeling. Well, there's a bunch of external tools for data viz. They're not, in the button in Power BI, but we can go and download them. There's a ton of free resources out there.
Mm. That's interesting. Yeah. So much more things that I
There's
didn't know.
also Microsoft has accessibility insights, and it's a browser add-in. So once I've published my report to powerbi.com, I do try to run through it with that. And that usually catches tab order and some color contrast stuff as well. So it can catch any final things that I may have missed. But I run through my checklist. I wrote the checklist, but I still have to pull it up and make sure I didn't miss a single thing. Just anything from, did you put important information behind a visual interaction where somebody has to, click on multiple things? If it's really important, shouldn't it be, featured more prominently? Stuff like that is in my checklist that, an accessibility insights tool is never going to cover because they don't have the context of what it is you're trying to convey. If you get good at data viz, you start making cleaner, clearer charts, and that actually helps accessibility as well. So I have things like, are your chart titles very clear, but also, does every chart have a single message? Are you trying to do too much with one chart? Because that affects everybody. If your chart isn't conveying anything in particular, you just put it out there. And it's not for kind of ad hoc reporting where people are doing more exploratory stuff. If it's more explanatory, like you've got the quarterly sales report, then that's probably a problem for everybody, including people with any disabilities or without. It doesn't really matter. Your chart isn't clear. So stuff like that has to be considered. And, I've been thinking about this and designing for this literally for years now. and I'm still learning new things every day. So you probably won't get it. I never get it 100% right, I'm sure. And you'll use wrong, verbiage when you're talking about it, and that's okay because trying is better than not trying.
Yeah.
Making progress and learning new things is good, even if you don't have it all. And Power BI will change. Um, we didn't have tab order when we started. We didn't have the way where you can set tab order kind of automatically based on the position on the page. And that came in earlier in the second half of 2021. So as you come across things, then, you give feedback and say, I really wish it would be. I've been harping on the tab order thing for literally years. I did a chat with John Schwabish like 2 years ago and said, I really wish they would just make this thing. And it showed up. And I'm sure it wasn't just me, but like, add my voice to the pile of people who say, we really need this for accessibility reasons. We see
Yeah.
things come through ideas all the time that ends up eventually in the product. So even if you think you're not an expert, when you encounter a user that's like, I can't use this because X, and it's kind of an accessibility issue, go put it out there. Somebody else can decide, whether it's going to make the list or not. But very few people actually ask for accessibility enhancements, to be honest.
Of course. Yeah. And so actually, that kind of reminds me also about Power BI, like other things that are really bad. Like, for example, I can imagine like the bookmarks and all the visuals that are hiding between each other. And like some people build like big bookmarks, like 20 bookmarks. And how does that affect it?
Um, For the most part, that kind of just works. So if we're talking about like screen readers and keyboard, when a visual is hidden,
Hmm.
you can't access the visual. It doesn't get read. It's not keyboard accessible. So whatever's on the screen is basically what a screen reader reads, what a keyboard user accesses. And bookmarks themselves are keyboard accessible. So when you go in that menu that has the whole list, they can tab through and choose a bookmark if that's what you want your users to do. So it's a lot. There could be, especially if you have 20 or something that
Yeah.
people have to choose or interact with, there's probably some cognitive accessibility issues where it's just overly complex. But I would say that might present some usability issues in general as well. So that's something kind of to consider in your design. But for the most part, it just works. But what you have to do is make sure you've gone to every bookmark and checked your tab order and your colors and all of that. You need to check every view that you make. So if you make 20 views, you're going to be checking 20 views.
Yes.
I've made reports that had a bunch of bookmarks and there were reasons behind it. So I'm not going to say you should never, but the more stuff you add into your report, the more complexity you add, there should be a good reason behind it.
Yeah. That's in
What
general.
goal are you helping your user accomplish by adding this extra chart, this extra bookmark? If you can
Yeah.
tell me that there was a purpose and a message, then it's probably good. Just make sure that you've got some kind of baseline accessibility. And you can use the Microsoft Docs. They pretty much have a list of all the features you can use and the things you should check. If you don't want to use my blog post, mine's a little, I keep it up to date a little more often, but they're almost the same. And I add extra stuff like check your interactivity between visuals and things that are not necessarily a feature, but
Yeah.
you know, just run through it. It's not hard. And the complexity thing is as much usability as it is accessibility. And if I could, hammer that in one more time, we keep treating accessibility as a separate thing, but it should be just part of your design process. We have other constraints within which we have to design. I get crazy color palettes all the time where some company, their marketing team, their web designers made a color palette and they've never really considered that website design color palette isn't a good data viz color palette. And so we work, to make adjustments to stay within branding guidelines. We work to make sure, oh, this report has to work on a phone really well or a tablet because people are out in the field using it. I don't treat accessibility as any different than that. It's a design constraint. So if I know someone is colorblind, I know someone uses a keyboard, then that's a high priority design constraint that I build in.
Makes sense. And that kind of brings us me to another question, which I think you already also answered already too. Like, are some visuals better than others? But I think that also kind of goes back to what you mentioned earlier. You have to think about how you visualize things anyway. So simpler the better. And that kind of goes with visualizations too, or visuals.
Yeah. So if your data is simple, then your visualization should probably be simple. If you have really complex data that you need to represent all together, then maybe you have a more complex visual, but sometimes that means you have multiple visuals. I have a special hatred for the combo chart, the line and bar chart, because it's a horrible way to represent things. When your line crosses your bar, what does it mean? It means absolutely nothing. But let's say someone isn't adept at interpreting charts and they don't know that that's just a weird construct that people have adopted for poor reasons. They're trying to figure out, like, there's got to be some significance there. Those two numbers are the same. Well, there's no significance. We're just bad at making charts, and that somebody adopted that habit, and it, took hold on lots of people. When I design stuff like that, I do um, separate line above and a bar chart below, and I use the same x-axis. So I can see the same information at the same time, but they're not crossing each other needlessly. So I think there are things like that where it can be confusing for anyone
Yeah.
that we should get rid of. Some custom visuals you want to watch out for, that they just weren't designed with accessibility in mind. Some of them are. Um, some of the OKViz visuals will actually have options for you to check color vision deficiency stuff. So that's kind of cool. So if you look for the ones that you know are more accessible, that can be really helpful. Others, like I mentioned earlier, that waffle chart, when you do the accessible show data table and it comes up looking kind of weird, you have to consider if that's a main way you want people to interact with that data, that's important. The play axis, things that move.
Yeah, I was
There's like
thinking
a
about that.
network diagram where the balls bounce around. I don't ever want something to bounce. It's
So
just
what about
really
so what about
distracting.
decomp tree?
Decomposition trees, I think, are fine because you can interact with them and the user can choose, how many levels they want to go deep. They can choose when they want to go back up. So I don't see that as a problem. A whole lot of the accessibility guidelines for interactivity are about giving the user control. So if you want something to kind of page through things to change, I see a lot of people, and I've done it, use the play axis. So it'll change a category every
Hmm.
5 to 10 seconds. It needs to not auto start, and there needs to be a way for a user to choose when they want it to go to the next thing. Because the last thing you want to do is stress somebody out when they're reading your report. So let's say, it's somebody who takes a little more time to read for whatever reason, because they're dyslexic, because it's in a language they don't understand, because it's got terminology they don't understand, just because they're new to their job. Um, you don't want them to go, oh my gosh, it changed. Like, where did it go? And now they're like, I don't know what that said. Don't stress people out with your database. Give them control. So, okay, it changed, but you already noticed on the page there's this big button that says, hey, here's where you start, here's where you stop, here's how you can go back to read the thing that you missed that we changed on you, and give users more control. That's
Yeah.
really hard to do as a designer inside a low code tool. There are fewer options than if I was writing my own, code like D3 or something to make data viz. But there are, they've also abstracted a lot of things away. So I don't have to worry about ARIA tags for screen readers because Power BI covers that for me. I don't have to worry about high contrast views because Power BI has that built in. If your Windows settings are on one of the high contrast accessibility settings, then Power BI is also on the high contrast
Yeah.
accessibility settings. What I need to know is that I should test that. I've actually had it where a custom visual didn't change. So everything else was like a black background with bright green. And that's the two simple high contrast colors. And then I had like I want to say it was the waffle chart again. Um, in blue and orange because it didn't change correctly. And I don't know if that's the custom visual designer's fault or just a weird bug in Power BI, but you want to try to catch all of that stuff when you're testing, and you don't have to be an expert for that. You kind of just make a list and click around and check all those options to make sure that you don't see anything that stands out. And there are way more official ways to test, but just as a person starting out, click on stuff, see what it's like.
I mean, it makes sense. I think actually what I'm taking up from this is actually making more accessible reports, make you a better report designer.
Hmm.
And that's, yeah, I think that's already something I definitely took away from this. So, so let's say I'm a company and I want to make sure my teams are building accessible reports. What advice would you give them? Like, how would you set that up and how can you scale it to the rest of the team?
I think you have a working group come up with guidelines and you use other people's materials. So you look at the WCAG standards, you look at the Power BI accessibility checklist that I have or that the Microsoft Docs have, and then you adapt that for your company. It doesn't take much, but every group that has a report designer in it, a report builder, should participate and then figure out which things work for you, what you want to add. If there's already a color palette for your company, then you put that in the guidelines so that no one has to check color every single time. And once you kind of got a rough consensus, you try it out and you live with it for 6 months. And so every report that you publish, report designers agree to follow these guidelines. And if you're going to publish reports for a big audience, I've seen companies that make you go through like a little quiz, a little training before they give you your Power BI license,
Mm.
to say, what, I understand what this data is. I understand how to design things according to guidelines. And people roll their eyes at it, but it's kind of one of those, I acknowledge the terms of use. My terms of use for giving you a Power BI license is that you'll design, in a fairly accessible way. And over
Actually, that
time, people can provide feedback and say, what, this needs to change. This doesn't work for me, or we should add this in.
and then, so do you know if it's part of the current like um, COE documentation for Microsoft that we have that Matthew has written with Melissa? That would be actually interesting to put it in there too.
Yeah, that would be a good idea. I think a lot of the COE stuff focuses on kind of sharing and data modeling and that type of thing. So, which are all very important, but
Actually,
because
yeah, let me send
data
them a
is
message.
is okay. I'll have to bother Melissa too. She and I chat all the time. Um, because data viz feels less concrete, a lot of people shy away from making hard and fast guidelines because everything is very context dependent, right? But you can't do nothing. So
Yeah,
even if you add extra constraints that people feel are a little overbearing, kind of so what? You made it more accessible.
yes.
In the end, most people are kind of making bar charts. Like, I would guess that, 50% of Power BI users keep things really simple. If you can design templates that already have things pretty accessible, you can design, you can import your color themes and give that to people, then you can help bypass the struggle, and it'll be a constant struggle, is it's lots of little detailed work in a tool that promises to be very easy to use. And so there's a combination of responsibilities there of what does Microsoft need to do to make Power BI, uh, the designing experience in Power BI, easy to make accessible reports, and what is it my responsibility to do as a designer? Microsoft can't pick your colors for you, but they, maybe they could tell you that, and they do have one color palette in the built-in stuff that promises to be high contrast. I'm picky and I'm not a huge fan of it, but at least it's there. So, what can be built into Power BI? Like the tab order thing where we just click a button and now the tab order is probably pretty close to right. That's a Microsoft thing.
Yeah.
Ch- Changing my colors to be more high contrast so people can read it, that's a designer responsibility thing. So figure out, where the line is right now and make sure the designers understand their responsibilities and give feedback to make it easier. A long, long time ago in the beginning of Power BI, the KPI visuals didn't let you change the colors, like they were pink or green. Well, that pink and green all looks like brown to a person with color vision deficiency. So somebody gave feedback and it changed.
Yeah.
And that's the constant like evolution. So get as good as you can with the tools and settings that we have now. Figure out what you have to do. If you don't care about design, then embrace the guidelines. Just do this every time and don't think about it. That, makes it easier on everybody.
Makes sense. All right, that makes total sense. So follow the guidelines. That's really the most important topic here. Like follow the checklist. I'll definitely put the link to your blog in the comment section below. So let's talk about something else. Just the regular Power BI is a question I like to ask everyone who comes on the channel. What is the most exciting feature of Power BI that released in the last year for you? It can be anything.
I don't remember. I mean, I kind of think this is going to sound really dumb, but the redo of powerbi.com and the way that it's designed and how there's a data set page now is actually really helpful for people. And it's a small thing, but it's so much easier to point someone to that to get them to settings for their data set. And so this one small thing made it easier for thousands of people to go and, set their data set refresh, go find information that was a little bit hidden before. So I kind of like that.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, it's probably a lot of work too from the Power BI engineering side of the world. So that makes sense. Yeah, I think I learned a lot about accessibility. And again, I mentioned before, for me, it's most interesting to think about. It's all about making it simple, making it easy. And it's not just for people who have disabilities, it's actually for all of us, because making it more readable, understandable is good for everyone. And yeah, that definitely struck true on me. So I want to thank you for your time. I learned a lot. And yeah, I hope to see you in person again in some conference when the whole corona is over. And yeah, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
And that concludes another episode of Kasper On BI. I hope you've learned a lot. I learned a lot. I now know more about accessibility, how to think about it, how to apply it to my reports. And I think it's a very important topic. So I'm glad we took some time to talk about it. There's many more things coming up this year. So please hit the like button if you like this episode. Hit the subscribe button if you want to keep up to date on what's happening and what's going on. And with that, I'll see you next time.